All right, lesson 4-1 is about constructing and interpreting scatter plots. There is a whole lot of overlap between topic 3 and topic 4. So some of this, most of this should seem pretty familiar to you. And like I said, no math required and very little new material. This is a lot of review from topic 3. Okay, so on this first solve and discuss it page, I just kind of want to pick out and talk about a few things about interpreting a table, okay? So the first thing I want to remind you that you will want to write down on your paper is that in a table that's up and down, right? Vertical table, the first column is always your X, the second column is always your Y. So social media posts per day is your X. Your new subscribers is your Y. Okay, it's important to remember that in a table, your X is always the first column. If it's in a horizontal table, your X is always on top, your Y is always on bottom. Okay, that's the first thing, because you will have to be able to take this information from a table and construct your own graph. So you're going to need to know which one goes on the X-axis and which one goes on the Y-axis. The other thing is when you're looking at this data, you just kind of have to pick apart and kind of think about it in a real world setting. So this is social media posts per day and new subscribers. So looking at the data, how many social media posts per day seem to garner the most new subscribers? What do you guys think? Dalton, what do you think? How many posts per day seem to get you the most new subscribers? 5. 5 and 6 is kind of that sweet spot. So if you were to need to kind of interpret this data, you would say that days 1 through 4, it increases a little bit each day. When you hit day 5, that's kind of the peak. That's the sweet spot, 5 posts per day. 6, it starts to go down a little bit. And then 7, 8, and 10, it continues to drop. So if you wanted to get the most new subscribers, how many posts should you put on your social media a day? 5. Okay. If you were to graph this, okay, you would need to remember that this is an X and a Y. So these two together would make an ordered pair. And so if you were graphing this on a scatter plot, you would graph the point 140 to represent this data. And so if you were writing on your or constructing a scatter plot, you would name your X-axis social media posts per day. And you would name your Y-axis new subscribers. And then you would post the point 140 to represent that data point. And then you would plot the rest. And what you would see that as your social media, and we're not actually going to do it, but your graph would look something, and you don't even have to write this, but your graph would look something like this, right? It would trend up, 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 and then would kind of hit that 5, and then it would start trending down. Okay, so your graph would look something like this as your social media posts go from 1 to 10, right? And this 5 is kind of that peak area. Okay. All right, let's see. I want you to use this blank space at the bottom of your page to write these 4 words and that they all mean the same thing. Okay, so take a minute and write this down. The word trend, the word association, correlation, and relationship. You're going to see a lot of these terms used interchangeably. They all mean some sort of pattern that you can see on your graph once you graph all the points. I will tell you that in this book, we see relationship and association the most. In your 9th grade curriculum that you're going to do next year, you'll have a whole unit on this idea. They use the word correlation almost solely they'll use trend and correlation more in your 9th grade curriculum. And in this curriculum, they use association and relationship more, but it all means the same thing. Okay, does everybody have this written down? I want to make sure when I go to walk and check your notes, I'm going to look for this on this first page. All right, does anybody need me to wait a minute? Okay, so like I said, we're going to use these words interchangeably. I might say trend, association, correlation, or relationship, but I'm always asking you about the pattern that you see in a graph. And we've already talked about what patterns we see in Luciana's graph up there or table up there. All right, so if we look at example 1, we're asked to construct a scatter plot, okay? So again, we're given some data in a table, and we're told, it says Luciana analyzes the data collected to determine how long after posting a new blog, her new homepage receives its maximum number of new views. Her data are presented in the table. And so the two things we're comparing here, it says, how can she determine whether there is a relationship between, and here's the two things we're comparing, time after posting, which is right here. That's one thing we're comparing. And we're comparing that with the number of new views. So that's the other thing we're comparing. And like I said a minute ago, and you're going to want to add this to your notes, okay, is that if it is a table that is a horizontal table like this, which means it goes side to side, your top is your X, your bottom is your Y. And that's important because if you're not given a graph already and you have to construct your own, you're going to have to label the X and the Y axis. And so you're going to need to know which one is the X data and which one is the Y data. Now, in this case, they already have it made for you. Okay, so if we look here at this step 1, it says draw a scatter plot. And then it tells you that a scatter plot is a graph in the coordinate plane that shows the relationship between two sets of data. And in this case, that is time after posting and number of new views. Those are the two data points that we're looking at. And then you have to construct this graph. And again, they've already done it for you, but we know that X is time in hours, right? And so that is why our X-axis is time in hours. And we're told that the Y is the number of new views. And so we would name our Y-axis number of new views. The other thing we're going to have to do is if it's not numbered for us, we are going to have to decide how to number the X and the Y axis. Now, I'm kind of jumping ahead because they don't really use the terminology up top, but they use it right here. They say, how would she choose scales for the X and Y axis? And this is what that means. It means if you look at your X data, okay, your X data, the lowest number is a 1 and the highest number is a 7. So that tells you that your X-axis needs to at least go from 0 to 7, right? You're going to have space on your X-axis for at least 0 to 7. So it would make sense to go 2, 4, 6, 8. Okay, that's scaling your X-axis. And that just means deciding that each block is going to be worth 1, right? That's what scaling means. Then if you look at your Y data, okay, your Y data is going to go from 25 is your lowest and your highest is 500. So that tells you that your Y-axis, and they actually don't complete it. And so I want you guys to complete it because they don't write the last one here. They leave room for it, but they don't write it. You're going to have to scale your Y-axis to handle points from 0 to 500. Well, you are not going to scale this to where every box equals 1 because you would have to have 500 boxes, and that doesn't make sense, right? So you have to decide how are you going to divide up your X-axis, and going by hundreds seems to, actually this one goes by 50s, doesn't it? They only write the hundreds, but they say that every box equals 50. And so we could even go in here and we could fill in some of the blanks, but they've just chosen to actually write every other box as 100, 200, 300. And that's fine. That's how they've scaled their Y-axis. Okay. So that's what scaling means. Then the next thing you have to do is you have to actually plot each point. And I'm not going to replot all of these. They're already done for you. But in a horizontal graph, right? This is your X and your Y that go together. So if you were to write them as an ordered pair, it would look like this, right? That's your X and your Y represented in that first column. So you would plot that. And if plotting points is difficult for you, I'll show you the way that I kind of show it when I first start teaching this to students, is your X is a 2. So you come over here to your X-axis and you find the 2. And you can either mentally do it or you can use really light dash marks with your pencil and then erase them. But you can go straight up from 2. Okay, and again, you can either do this mentally or you can use dash marks. And then you find 350 on your graph and you go over from 350, and where those two intersect, that is where you drop the point. And if you can do it mentally, or like I said, you can do it with really light dash marks. If you do it with really light dash marks, you're going to want to come back and erase them, or else it's going to really muddy up your graph. So if you do it, it's fine, but just make sure you go back and erase them. Okay. And that data point stands on the graph for the point 2350. And then they went ahead and continued to graph the rest of the data points. And then it says Luciana can use a scatter plot to determine whether there is a relationship between the two data sets. If you just look at the table, it's kind of hard to tell if there's a relationship, right? It's kind of hard to see if there's some sort of trend or relationship going on. But when you see it on a graph, it's pretty easy to see there is an association or a trend or a correlation, and it's that it does this. Okay, that's what the trend or the association is. So from that, you could say that the more time a social media post is out there, the less number of new views it gets. So when in your time frame, when would your social media posts get the most number of views? Yeah, they're in that first 1 to 2 hours. After that, it continues to fall. And then the longer it's been out there, the fewer and fewer views it's going to get. Okay. All right. So it says, try it. Luciana collects data about the number of entries, the ages of the subscribers who enter the concert giveaway. The point that represents the data in the fourth column has the coordinates. Now, again, what they're asking you to do here is to remember which one is the X and which one is the Y. In a horizontal graph, this is your X and this is your Y. So if you look out to that fourth column, which is right here, how would you write that as an ordered pair? What do you guys think? How would I write that fourth column as an ordered pair? Jacob, what do you think? What would I put in these boxes right here? Yeah, 13 and 9. The 13 is the X, the 9 is the Y. And what that requires you to know is from that table, which one is the X, which one is the Y. Now, the other thing it says is explain how Luciana would choose scales for the X and Y axis. Well, this is what I was talking about above. So we're going to actually do that. We're going to construct a little graph here. What are we going to name the X axis? What are we naming the X axis? Chase? Yes. And we want to put in parentheses in years. So our X axis name is, and it tells us in the table, that's the X column. So we know that this is age in years. Okay. What are we naming the Y axis? Olivia? Good. Number of entries. So number of entries. Okay. Now we have to decide how to scale it. And what that means is that we have to look at the data points in our X column and look at what's the highest it's got to go. We know we're going to start at 0, but we're going to go from 0 up to our highest one, which is 15. So we need to scale our X axis in a way that we can plot data points from 10 to 15. So you could do 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, 14, 16. Okay, that would give us enough space to be able to do that. You could do 5, 10, 15. Okay, that's not as detailed, but you could do it that way. So not everybody's answers are going to look the same because you might scale it one way and somebody else might scale it another. The data points are all going to look about the same, but the scale might be different. So if we do 2, 4, 6, 8, let's see, 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, 14, 16. Okay, that takes me up to 16, which tells me I'm going to have enough room to go as high as 15. That's the highest X value I have. Now I'm going to scale my Y side. So I look at my Y's and I ask myself, what's my highest Y? Well, my highest Y is 10, right? So I know I'm going to scale my Y axis and I'll go 2, 4, 6, 8, 10. So 2, 4, 6, 8, 10. And they're scaling my Y axis. And it does usually help to write the numbers there so we remember what we did. And on the X-axis, I've got 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, 14. So now when I go to graph these points, this is an ordered pair, 10, 8. So I'm going to go over to the 10, which is right there. Okay, right there is my 10. And I'm going to go up to where I'm level with the 8 on the y-axis. So I'm going to go up from 10, level to 8, and I'm going to drop a point right there. That's this first point right here. Then I'm going to go to the next point. It's the point 11/8. So I know 11 is halfway between 10 and 12. So I'm going to go straight up from there, and it should be level with my purple one because it's also a y value of 8. Everybody should be doing this. This needs to be in your notes. If I put it on the board, there's a reason for it. Okay. Next, I'm going to do my next point, which is 12/9. So I'm going to go over to 12 and up to 9. 9 is halfway between 8 and 10. And then I've got the point 13/9. So I'm going to go halfway between 12 and 14. And it should be level with that neon green one because they're both at a Y level of 9. And then, need some more colors here. I'm going to graph 14/10. So up from 14 and then up to 10. And then my last one is this 15/10. So I halfway between 14 and 16 is 15. And it should be level with that blue one because they're both at a Y level of 10. So now I have created a scatter plot. I've named my axes. I've scaled my numbers to where I can graph everything. And then I have graphed each point on the graph. Okay. All right. And now I can see that there is a correlation. And because it's going up, I would say that it is a positive correlation or a positive relationship or a positive association, because as the age gets higher, the number of entries tends to get higher. Okay. Both are going up. So it's an increase. So it is a positive, and I believe your book uses association more, so I will put association. All right, so that really jumps us into example number 2. And with example number 2, there's really no work for you to do. It's just learning some definitions, and we've already talked about this. Positive association and negative association. If the cluster, which this is this term right here, if the cluster is going uphill when you read it left to right, like this one is, okay, this is positive association, okay, because it's trending uphill. So it's positive association. I'm going to skip gap for a second, and I'm going to go to this outlier definition. The outlier is kind of that one rogue point that just doesn't jive with the rest of the group, okay? And you will get that a lot in data, is you'll have kind of that one rogue person that doesn't tend to do what the group does, okay? And that's called an outlier. And then the gap is just simply this space between the cluster and the outlier. So the cluster is the main group. That's where you'll see a trend, either increasing or decreasing. The gap is the distance between the cluster and the outlier, and an outlier is 1 or 2 points that maybe don't fit with the rest of the data, okay? All right, so do I have any hunters in the room, like go out hunting? And okay, what kind of shot does this look like? What's that called? Do you guys know? When a one bullet has a bunch of little BBs in it and it just, yeah. Yeah, birdshot or a buckshot. I've heard both terminology. That's kind of what this is, right? There is no relationship. You can't say that as minutes played goes up, fouls made does what? Some are up, some are down, some are right, some are left. It's just kind of all over the place. You cannot draw, and you don't have to do this. This is just, I'll erase it. You cannot draw a line to go through a cluster and catch most of the points with just maybe 1 or 2 outliers. You can't draw a negative line that goes through most of the cluster and then maybe has 1 or 2 outliers. There's nowhere on this graph that you can draw a line and catch most of the points. They're just random and they're all over the place. And when this happens, and this is what I want you to underline in your book, that's called no association. So if you look at this triad at the bottom of page 221, it says Avery also tracks the number of minutes a player plays and the number of points the player scores. Describe the association between the 2 data sets. Tell what the association suggests. We did this in topic 3. When you're asked to describe a relationship or describe an association, use words from the axes titles. So you're going to say as minutes played increases, right? When you are describing the association, okay, that's right here. This is what they're asking you to do. Describe the association. When you're doing that, use words from both axes. So as minutes played, everybody should be writing. I don't do this for my health. When you ask me in your homework, how do you describe a relationship? I'm going to point you back to this. And if you don't have it written down, that's on you. You're going to have to go back and watch the video and figure it out. As minutes played increases, this should look familiar from topic 3. Okay, what happens? Points scored what? Does it decrease? Points scored. Notice I'm using words from the axes. Increases. Okay, that's the mathy explanation. Then it says, tell what the association suggests. Now you're taking yourself out of that math terminology and just in a real world situation, what does this mean? What does it mean? Just in a real world situation, not using the as minutes played increases, points scored increases. That's the mathy terminology.
It means like more minutes.
Yeah, the more you play, the more you're going to score. And that's the real world explanation of what the math explanation means. So you are, if it asks for both, you are going to have to include both in your answer. Okay, so the more you play, the more points you score. Okay, and again, that's this one right here is the math explanation. Very, very specific writing. You're going to want to use words like increase, decrease, right? You're going to want to use exact terminology, minutes played, exact terminology, points scored. Then when you go to put it in a little bit more real world scenario, you can get a little bit looser with your wording. Okay. All right. That's really it. This is just a kind of a review. This is an example of positive correlation right here. Your points are trending up. And you really don't have an outlier that's real far away from the cluster. This is an example of negative correlation where you've got most of your cluster trending down, but you do have this outlier out here. There is a gap between the cluster and that kind of that one rogue point. And then this is an example of no association because it's just that scatter. Okay. I will give you a little hint on your homework. So your homework is going to be pages 223 to 224, and it's all the problems. It's 6 through 11. But I am going to give you just a little bit of information on how to answer these, okay? On just a couple of them. On number 6, again, you're going to have to know on the table, you're going to have to know which one is X and which one is Y. Because you are going to name your you're going to name your x-axis and your y-axis based on the table name. Okay, so you've got to know which one here, which one you're calling X and which one you're calling Y. And then you're going to plot all of the points and they have one plotted for you. Okay, that's what number 6 is asking. Number 7, the scatter plot is already done for you. And it represents the prices and the number of books sold in a bookstore. And then it says, identify the cluster in the scatter plot. And what this means, yes. It does. And that's why I was specific up here in our notes when I showed you how to, right here, when I told you how to name a table, which one is always the X and which one is always the Y. They're not though. Which one would you call X, the top one or the bottom one? And it's called what? Okay, so what would you call your x-axis? And then what's your y? So are they the same?
No, but outside, I can see.
It's okay. So you just have to determine which one's your X, which one's your Y, and then name your axes accordingly, and then plot your points, okay? For number 7, it's already plotted for you, and it wants you to identify the cluster. Now, you can either actually draw this or you can just do it mentally, but what you want to do is you want to box in the cluster, and then when it says identify the cluster, you're going to identify the prices that it situates in and the number of books sold. So what you're going to say is the cluster is, between prices, what it's the prices that our cluster sits between. Yes. Yeah, between 10 and 25. So when we identify the cluster, we know that it sits between the prices of 10 and 25 and, okay, between, look at the x-axis. What's it sit between? Yeah, between 10 to 20 books sold. So when you're asked to identify the cluster, you're going to have to identify the whole range of X's that it sits between and the whole range of Y's that it sits between. Okay. Then it says, how does the scatter plot show the relationship between the data points? So again, when you're describing relationship, you need to use terminology from the X and from the Y and describe what's happening. As one increases, does the other increase or decrease? Okay. And then one other place, I will give you a little hint. When it asks you to identify outliers, you're going to want to actually identify them by their coordinate. Because an outlier is one single point or two single points that are their own lone points, identify them as ordered pairs. Okay? Go back to your notes. It's in there. Yeah, the notes we just took. It's on page 221 at the top under example 2. Okay. All right. So page 223, 224, 6 through 11. Make sure if it asks you to explain or justify, that means I need to see a sentence written. If it asks for a relationship, I need words from the x-axis and words from the y-axis. Okay. If it asks for what does it mean, that means real world explanation. Okay, for those of you at home, if you have any questions, shoot me an email. You can, if you don't have your workbook at home, I do have a Cami version of pages 223 and 224 attached to the assignment.